the rising sun over the manor grounds did not bring a golden dawn of pastoral perfection, but merely a creeping, damp light that struggled to penetrate the grime-caked, leaded panes. Morning in this household was less an awakening and more a slow, ritualistic emergence from deep slumber, a gradual reassertion of order onto bodies and minds weary with sin and ambition. There was no instant burst of invigorating life. Rather, there was the persistent scrape of iron against stone, the dull clank of cookware, and the low murmur of voices already steeped in necessary routine. The sheer physicality of simply existing within these thick-walled structures dictated a certain pace, a hushed reverence for the domestic mechanics that upheld the fragile edifice of nobility. Every action, from fetching water to dressing in heavy woolen robes, possessed a deliberate gravity, the persistent quietude of the manor walls, having established a rigid rhythm of necessary order and domestic routine, prepared the ground for another kind of violation. The sanctity of the body, in the eyes of medieval society, was not simply spiritual. It was deeply intertwined with physical health, governed by an intricate and often baffling understanding of humors, fluids, and unseen atmospheric poisons. To be sick was to be fundamentally unbalanced, a disharmony that required radical intervention, often involving parts of oneself or others. The great physicians and barber surgeons were figures of imposing, yet frequently unreliable, authority. They operated within an established academic framework, rooted in the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. But this theoretical structure provided ample room for questionable practice to flourish. Their diagnoses rarely focused on simple ailment. They sought imbalances, a surplus of phlegm here, an excess of black bile there, a corruption of the blood that manifested physically, or worse, through inappropriate bodily discharge. And so, the examination began, not with intuition, but with a series of disturbing physical metrics. It was a process predicated on visible leakage and palpable discomfort. A patient might present with fatigue, a vague malaise far removed from any obvious injury. The physician, armed with scalpels, rudimentary funnels, and an overabundance of theoretical confidence, would commence the diagnosis by observing the subtle rhythms of life itself, the sweat, the waste, the tears. These fluids were treated not as metabolic byproducts, but as diagnostic gold mines, potent liquids whispering secrets about the patient's moral state and internal plumbing. The examination quickly veered away from mere humoral theory and entered into a realm of profound suspicion. If one's phlegm was thick, it suggested emotional stagnation, or perhaps an overly indulgent diet. If the urine ran a peculiar hue, it could denote not merely kidney distress, but a corruption of the vital spirit itself. The body became a complex chemical equation, constantly flirting with instability, and every strange symptom, a persistent rash, unexplained weakness, chronic digestive trouble, was catalogued as evidence of a deeper, almost moral decay. The remedies, naturally, followed this logic of profound suspicion. Since the imbalance was so deeply entrenched, the cure had to be equally drastic, often cyclical in its violation of bodily integrity. Bloodletting remained a constant rite, considered purifying and necessary. But beyond the lancet came treatments involving complex mechanical devices, elaborate diets of purging herbs, emetics designed not just to induce sickness, but to strategically expel certain noxious humors, sometimes requiring nothing more than repeated vomiting into a designated vessel. The absurdity deepened when physicians ventured into what we might now categorize as sexual health. The coupling of physical vitality with moral virtue was an inescapable medieval concern. Were the aches and pains merely physical, or did they signal a failing in one's adherence to Christian discipline? Excess passion, conversely, was not just tempting, it was physically destabilizing. It could sour the humors, creating hot flushes, nervous tremors, or profound lethargy. The physician, therefore, became an adjudicator of pleasure as well as pain. He didn't merely treat the rash, he sought to diagnose the root cause. Was it poor diet? A hidden resentment? Or was it perhaps a failure in controlling one's carnal appetites that manifested physically? This created a medical gauntlet where every bodily function, from menstruation to ejaculation, became fraught with academic scrutiny. Fluids were commodities. Menstrual blood held medicinal value, and semen in certain circles of questionable expertise was rumored to possess potent magical properties, often incorporated into poultices or unguents meant to restore strength and vigor. The sheer weight of these medical secrets turned the act of caring for one's body into a highly ritualized, darkly humorous performance art. The funnels became symbols not only of extraction, but of control. They represented the systematic draining away of excess, be it bile, sweat, or emotion, in the name of restoration. The cure was less an infusion of goodness and more a controlled catastrophe designed to shock the system back into compliance with both natural law and divine expectation. The patient underwent cycles of forced purging, from ingesting foul concoctions of bile greens and wormwood to having their bodily fluids ritually removed. It was a state of perpetual instability, masked by the confident pronouncements of men in academic robes. The underlying message that vice seeped into one's very blood was more pervasive than any single diagnosis. To be human, to feel intensely, or to engage with desire was to constantly threaten the finely balanced equilibrium that the physician, for coin and reputation, promised could be restored. The confession of the physician thus became less a record of science and more an elaborate compendium of suspicion. Every body carried a catalog of potential flaws, a sticky secretion here, a discoloration there, a fever linked perhaps to overheated passions rather than poor ventilation. And so life in the medieval manor was lived under the constant, authoritative gaze of medical curiosity, a state that suggested profound secrets could be extracted from the mundane functions of biology, linking every drop of sweat and every spent vial of blood back to the overarching tapestry of sin, necessity, and survival. If the manor's routine established a rhythm dictated by duty and decorum, then the counting house represented the pulse of necessity. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, every whispered secret, every inconvenient pleasure, eventually found its price tag stamped upon it. The body was not merely subject to the dictates of faith or philosophy. It was inherently economic, a commodity weighed against land titles, political marriages, and survival itself. To possess favor, whether from a local lord or a distant prince, often meant entering into transactions that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with balance sheets. The currency, therefore, was not gold alone, but the more flexible, adaptable medium of physical vulnerability and sexual access. From the lowest scrivener assisting in the exchequer to the highest noble arranging a dynastic alliance, every intimate moment carried ledger entries beneath its weight. The true power players understood this profound exchange. They recognized that a person's greatest weakness, their deepest need, their secret curiosity, or an unfulfilled yearning, was precisely what made them valuable currency. It was a systematic dismantling of personal autonomy in favor of collective survival, transforming the messy spectrum of desire into predictable assets. A lord might require proof of allegiance during times of fragile peace, demanding more than a sworn oath. He required the personal pledge of his vassal's body, or that of their kin. This rarely occurred in moments of passion, but rather in the chillingly formal settings of council chambers and negotiating halls, where the language used was one of diplomacy, treaties, and inherited rights. And yet the undercurrent pulsed with something far more primal. Consider the precarious balance of a feudal marriage itself. It was never simply an union of hearts. It was a sophisticated hedge against catastrophe. By binding two noble houses, its primary function was to merge land holdings and stabilize political spheres. Yet, this delicate scaffolding required perpetual maintenance, often resorting to forms of intimacy that were strategically managed. The sexual fulfillment exchanged between the bride's family and the groom's lineage was always secondary to the cementing of a border or the securing of a right to harvest yields. The pleasure itself was simply lubrication for the great grinding gears of the aristocracy. The subtle art of transactional favor permeated every level of society. A man struggling financially against predatory rivals might need an obscure piece of information, perhaps the whereabouts of a disloyal bannerman, or the specific weakness in a rival lord's claim to title. The price for this deadly intelligence was rarely coin. It demanded something more intimate, a momentary concession that stripped away dignity and privacy. These acts were not sudden betrayals. They often built up through slow attrition, like the steady leak of water eroding a carefully constructed stone wall. A person might agree to small compromises, a shared meal in an inappropriate manner, a prolonged conversation that crosses established boundaries, until finally, one devastating exchange tips the scales into open negotiation. This economic imperative meant that sexual morality was not something lived by choice, but something dictated by solvency. When your estate is mortgaged and your bloodline faces erasure, concepts like propriety or even consent, as we understand them today, were luxury notions afforded only to the utterly secure. Desire became a calculated risk, an investment of trust that could bankrupt a family faster than any military defeat. The most desirable persons, therefore, were often those with nothing left to lose: the indebted scholar, the disgraced minor noble, or even the woman whose economic stability rested solely on her ability to navigate powerful men's capricious affections. She became, quite literally, an asset portfolio. Beyond the high machinations of the lords and ladies, this transactional morality seeped into the rhythms of smaller towns and struggling families. Here, the stakes were terrifyingly visceral. Food on the table versus one's integrity, survival against the brutal weight of debt. For the merchant class, particularly those facing insolvency or punitive taxation, the negotiation could be equally grim. A man might find that an extended period of questionable intimacy with a powerful local magnate was the only way to secure credit for his shipping venture, keeping his employees fed and his family sheltered from destitution. It was a morally nauseating calculus, exchanging personal dignity for operational liquidity. The town itself became a giant ledger book, recording not just bushels of grain and sheaves of wheat, but hours of time and acts of favor. The consequences of these economic negotiations were complex and often traumatic. When the transaction was successful, the beneficiary gained far more than merely monetary wealth. They achieved stability. They survived the annual collapse of reputation or the devastating harvest failure. But this stability always came coated in a fine veneer of moral compromise, leaving scars that time and piety could never fully heal. The memory of the bargain, the specific nature of the favor exchanged, the moment of ultimate pliability, served as an invisible tether, binding the person to their past compromises. They were forever marked by the price they had paid, and those who sought power not through land, but solely through reputation, the court poets, the ambitious minor functionaries, the sycophants, were masters of exploiting this system. They learned to speak fluently in the language of obligation, mastering the art of flattery that masked an immediate demand for service. Flattery, in this context, was not merely compliment, it was reconnaissance, a careful assessment of what personal vulnerability could be triggered and against whom. To win the court's favor was to become indispensable, and indispensability, unfortunately, always carried a steep personal tariff. The intersection of law and finance created particularly rigid codes of conduct that enforced this sexual economy. Marital agreements stipulated not only lineage, but also explicit rules regarding cohabitation with non-allied parties, rules designed precisely to protect the collateral value of the bloodline. Divorce was ruinous, often resulting in complete financial destitution for the woman who found herself stripped of her legal claim on property and dependent entirely on either a male relative's charity or her own ability to enter into another highly compromised contract. Her body, therefore, became less an expression of self and more an active piece of negotiating hardware, whose optimal utilization was subject to detailed patriarchal management. In essence, the medieval world revealed that desire itself could be capitalized upon. Passion was merely a volatile asset class. It could swell rapidly during times of feast and celebration, but if poorly managed or misspent, it could lead to immediate financial collapse, a reputation ruined, an estate lost, a lifetime's ambition dissolved into debt. The scandals whispered in these halls were rarely about mere indecency. They were terrifyingly detailed accounts of leverage points, moments where the weight of necessity forced human beings to treat their deepest selves as negotiable tokens. They understood that sin was not just a spiritual failing requiring penance. It was fundamentally an economic vulnerability that could bankrupt a dynasty, and its management was therefore one of the most crucial yet darkest sciences practiced beneath the eaves of stone castles. The sanctuary of the Abbey was meant to be a fortress against the corrupting tide of the world, a place where the flesh could theoretically wither into pure piety. Yet, history proves that even within walls dedicated to divine obedience, the primal needs of man and woman found ways to echo. These institutions, built on austere vows and rigid rules, paradoxically became crucibles for intense emotional and physical pressure. The supposed purity was merely a carefully maintained veneer over deeply human complexities. Life here was governed by schedules, by bells, and by the watchful eyes of superiors whose authority was absolute, derived both from divine decree and earthly power. We must understand that in these contained environments, every transgression carried not just a spiritual weight, but an institutional one, threatening the very economic viability of the abbey itself. The structure of monastic life necessitated a rigorous discipline of bodies. The diet, the hours of labor, the even pace of movement, everything was calibrated to minimize deviation from the established norm. The physical body became, in effect, property of the collective. It was an instrument for devotion, not for individual desire. This enforced asceticism bred a unique form of tension, the deep frustration of being perpetually restrained. The self, when systematically diminished in importance by routine and rule, began to search elsewhere for definition. Consider the nature of power within these walls. It was rarely openly wielded. Instead, it operated through subtle enforcement, through theological mandates and social expectation. To challenge the rules was not merely a sin. It was an act of destabilization, a breach of communal trust that could result in exile or permanent censure. This dynamic created an intoxicating environment for whispered secrets and clandestine alliances. Desire, therefore, did not disappear simply because piety demanded it. Instead, it became highly refined, often cloaked in the guise of spiritual longing, the pursuit of transcendent love mistaken for physical intimacy, or the emotional attachment to a mentor misinterpreted as carnal yearning. These ambiguities were fertile ground for exploitation and power play. A novice's vulnerability was absolute. Their future lay entirely within the approval of the older sisters or brothers, who held the keys to intellectual advancement and social mobility. Their bodies, both physical and spiritual, were essentially apprenticeships in deference. The physical reality further complicates this picture. Monastic life involved constant contact with mortality, the sick, the dying, the poor, and often handling the gruesome realities of illness or childbirth that stained perfect vows. The shared suffering meant shared intimacy, which blurred the lines between therapeutic care and emotional entanglement. And when desire resurfaced, it was initially viewed through a strictly pathological lens, not merely sin, but a failure to adhere to sacred boundaries. The secrets contained within these cloistered walls were layered, almost like architectural buttresses, supporting a weight of carefully concealed emotion. They involved forbidden correspondences, the illegal exchange of goods and knowledge with the outside world, the whispers from village life that hinted at a richness and complexity beyond stained glass windows and psalters. These liaisons did not merely satisfy physical appetites. They were acts of rebellion against the very concept of contained identity. The economic implications cannot be overstated. The Abbey was often a massive landowner, its prosperity tied to its reputation for spiritual integrity. Scandal threatened that wealth just as surely as invasion. A whispered rumor of inappropriate conduct among high-ranking nuns or canons could lead to investigations that drained resources, eroded trust with secular lords, and potentially jeopardized the entire institution's legal standing. Thus, maintaining the facade of immaculate virtue became a form of critical risk management. And so, we find ourselves navigating a system where piety and pragmatism were fused into an inescapable knot. The most profound human connections, those born of genuine emotional desperation or undeniable carnal pull, were treated not as natural occurrences, but as deviations from a sacred financial ledger. Love was budgeted. Physical contact was regulated. The very trajectory of a life was subject to communal scrutiny. To survive within these walls meant mastering the art of visible conformity while harboring an invisible, potent undercurrent of forbidden knowing. It required silence, a profound, dangerous knowledge that could be bought and sold with a promise of discretion. The secrets were not merely private moments. They became powerful mechanisms of control capable of dismantling lives and destabilizing entire structures built upon devotion. The oppressive quiet of the cloister was a masterpiece of enforced discipline. It taught one to contain every breath, to calculate every gesture, knowing that within these walls, desire was not merely sinful, it was an act of profound structural negligence. But when we step away from the sacred architecture and into the marketplace, the temperature changes entirely. The tightly wound coil of monastic restraint suddenly meets the chaotic heat of human necessity. Here, in the bustling artery of the town square, piety and prurience mingle like spilled wine and sawdust. It is a place of overwhelming sensory input. The sharp bite of unwashed wool, the pungent smell of fish guts mingling with spice trade goods, the rhythmic cry of vendors, hawking everything from medicinal poultices to dubious political pamphlets. The marketplace refuses the quiet compliance of the manorial estate. It demands noise, grit, and visibility. If the Abbey was a performance of internal suppression, the market is an unscripted play. And in that raucous freedom, or illusion thereof, the true mechanics of medieval morality unfold with terrifying clarity. Here, sin is not confined to shadowed confessionals. It is visible, cheap, and transactional. The transaction is performed openly. A whisper exchanged over a stall laden with textiles, an appreciative glance across the cobblestones bought by a handful of copper coins. It suggests that while moral codes were omnipresent, their enforcement was geographically limited and financially motivated. The city watch, those men tasked with keeping the messy realities at bay, are key players in this ecosystem. They do not merely enforce laws against outright crime, they police moral deviation. They patrol against indecency, against excessive revelry, yes, but also against perceived threats to social order, the kind of destabilizing curiosity that makes people ask questions better left unasked about the porous boundaries between flesh and law. Observe the interaction. A passing merchant with suspiciously rich clothing brushes passed a washerwoman. The momentary physical contact is enough to send ripples through the air, forcing an immediate public reckoning. Does this brushing merely signify coincidence, or does it represent a transgression that requires formal intervention. To the city guard, it might be the difference between simple jostling and incipient vice, and their discretion becomes both their greatest tool and their most visible vulnerability. The moment is not about outright violation. It is about the perceived potential asterisk for violation, the unsettling flicker of desire in public view. This brings us to the sophisticated art of maintaining order through highly personalized scrutiny. The street does not merely contain vice, it commodifies control. Scandal, in this context, becomes a marketable vulnerability. A man might deliberately flirt with a known courtesan near the grain market, not necessarily for pleasure, but for witnesses, to establish proximity to desirable assets, or to subtly intimidate rivals. Conversely, the woman who sells medicinal herbs may use her knowledge of bodily chemistry and anatomy, the same deep understanding that physicians claim to enforce a version of modesty that is both deeply personal and highly profitable. Her reputation becomes a delicate balance sheet, enough desirability to be noticed, but enough perceived virtue to remain solvent in the eyes of the law. The economic scaffolding of this moral maintenance system was surprisingly brutal. Who paid for the watchful eye? The city government, naturally, but also powerful guilds or influential families who had a vested interest in keeping certain kinds of undesirable populations, like street performers, too suggestive, or medical charlatans pushing dangerous tonics under tight wraps. Their morality served their profit margins. The concept of public piety thus becomes nothing more than a form of crowd control. The visible religious processions, the loud recitation of saints' names, the public displays of devotion are not solely acts of faith. They are civic infrastructure designed to remind people where the boundaries lie and what the penalties for crossing them might be. They serve as visual reminders that even in the most chaotic open square, the law, divine, secular, and economic, is always watching. Consider the lower strata of society, the beggars, the hawkers, the laborers, whose very existence depends on their visibility, but whose lives are steeped in precarity. They navigate a razor-thin margin between honest survival and criminal indecency. To be seen too often, or with the wrong kind of yearning, could easily lead to accusations that were easier for the guards and more profitable for the local magistrate to prosecute. Necessity forces adaptation. One might adopt an exaggerated display of piety to deflect attention from a deeper, hungrier curiosity, or feign boisterous companionship to mask vulnerability. The city square is therefore not just a commercial exchange. It is a constant theater of risk assessment. Every encounter is weighted by potential consequence. The subtle glances exchanged are read as evidence of intent. The lingering touch during a bargain is documented in the unspoken rules of propriety. It's a complex dance or sexual energy, once thought to be only confined within bedrooms and private chambers, is instead mobilized into public performance, a necessary lubricant for the gears of medieval commerce. The guard patrols are not random. They follow invisible lines drawn by social contract and financial interest. They stop conversations that become *2* philosophical in their implication, or bargaining rituals that suggest a hidden commodity beyond wool or spices. When they intervene, it is seldom with brute force alone. More often, the power rests in the implied threat, the suggestion of record keeping, the mention of public decency statutes, the swift and silent disappearance into the back alley, the promise of an off-the-books reckoning. The marketplace does not grant freedom. It simply shifts the stage. It trades the controlled tension of the confined structure for the sprawling vigilance required in a crowd. And this profound contrast reveals the deepest mechanism at work. That moral behavior, whether dictated by God, law, or economic stability, is always, irrevocably, a transaction. The struggle for lineage, the sacred right to exist in perpetuity, was arguably the most terrifying and inflexible law of all. For men, land, name, and life itself hinged upon the perceived purity and stability of the bloodline. This single concern, the continuation of a dynasty, made sex not an act of devotion or pleasure, but a catastrophic legal undertaking. It was a matter of statecraft, masquerading as matrimony, where personal desires were immediately subordinated to the grand arithmetic of survival. The patriarchate established a profoundly rigid structure. Legitimate procreation was the ultimate goal. Any deviation from that prescribed coupling was viewed not merely as sin, but as an existential threat to the family estate itself. If you could not produce heirs, your entire world, your wealth, your title, your very place in society was considered forfeit. Thus, everything surrounding sexuality became encased in legal and economic peril. The rules governing who slept with whom, when, and under what pretext were exhaustively detailed within the complex web of property laws and noble treaties. The legitimacy of a child was nothing less than its primary, non-negotiable asset, instantly dictating its future inheritance rights and social standing. A questioned paternity could unravel centuries of accumulated status, leading to legal battles that spanned decades, draining fortunes and shattering reputations. Such uncertainty fostered a pervasive climate of suspicion. Even within the presumed sanctity of marriage, lines were constantly being tested by rumor, jealousy, and economic desperation. This tension became particularly acute when considering multiple marriages or relationships outside the approved line. While society often gossiped about sexual indiscretion as mere scandal in the context of inheritance law, it was a material failure, a flaw with tangible financial consequences. The perceived infidelity could trigger forfeiture clauses invalidate wills, and plunge entire houses into crippling legal jeopardy. The struggle for succession fueled strategies that were nothing short of brutal. When direct male heirs were lacking, or when the most promising lines were too weak to survive rival claims, the stakes rose dramatically. Marriage arrangements ceased being matters of affection and became high-stakes commodities traded between powerful families. The union was negotiated not over shared values or emotional compatibility, but over quantifiable assets, acreage, debts owed, political alliances, and military levies. Consequently, sexual control, who had access to whom, was inextricably linked with economic control. To secure a title deed or stave off a rival's claim, one might be forced into an arrangement that violated every personal principle they held dear. The resulting compromises were deeply messy, creating generations of moral debt and psychological trauma. The law dictated that the blood must flow through the approved channels, demanding compliance at all costs. This pressure manifested itself in elaborate, public displays of marital virtue and dutiful parenting, carefully curated to deceive both rivals and posterity. Every kiss, every shared meal, every whispered conversation was scrutinized for potential leakage, the telltale sign that a rival house might find fault with its claim to legitimacy. The law did not tolerate ambiguity, especially when gold or land were at stake. The lack of clear lines bred opportunism, legal loophole hunting, and outright exploitation. Women, in particular, found themselves trapped within this perilous intersection of dynastic duty and personal desire. They could become the most valuable assets in a family's vault, the living collateral securing immense wealth. Yet, their inherent power lay precisely in their unpredictable capacity for attraction or denial. The legal framework effectively reduced marriage to an economic partnership centered on reproductive output. The emotional life of the couple became secondary. What mattered was the produce of their union. Healthy sons who could bear flags and manage armies when this primary function failed, or when a compelling outside force threatened to redirect the patrimony. The system broke down into frantic, desperate measures. This dynamic established that in the medieval world, sexuality was never simply private. It possessed always public weight. It weighed upon titles, taxed by manorial courts, and sealed within dusty legal parchment. The body, and particularly the womb, became a vital piece of property, its capacity for giving heirs measured against every other asset on the ledger. The law created an intensely pressurized environment where emotional needs were simply absorbed into the calculus of survival. To be moral was to be strategic. To desire freely was to risk utter ruin. This constant, high-stakes calculation underpinned the seemingly stable veneer of medieval noble life, suggesting that, beneath the ceremonial armor and velvet drapery, lay a landscape governed not by honor or chivalry, but by ruthless genealogy and the terrifying economic imperative of bloodline continuity. The prevailing image of the medieval heartland is one of idealized chivalry, a world where noble passion was governed by lofty ideals and tournaments were mere expressions of courtly virtue. But to settle for this romantic narrative is to mistake the glossy surface sheen for the deep, muck-stained reality beneath. Courtly love, as documented in the surviving verses and illustrated on manuscript pages, often feels detached, a series of exquisite emotional gestures directed toward unattainable objects. Yet, upon closer examination, these elaborate laments and celebrated dances of devotion reveal themselves to be something far more visceral, much dirtier, and remarkably transactional. The poetry of the troubadours, particularly those renowned for their highly structured verse concerning unattainable ladies, the asterisk domina asterisk, was not merely an outpouring of pure, abstract yearning. It was a masterful exercise in performance, drawing its emotional power from the perceived scarcity and unattainability of the object of desire. The art form itself required an understanding of status games, social hierarchies, and public consumption. To sing of unattainable grace was to be acutely aware of one's own middling station within that very courtly economy. We have spent the preceding chapters mapping the infrastructure of control, how medicine defined the body through its fluids, how finance commodified passion for dynastic stability, and how both religious law and municipal statute monitored every flirtation. These principles of management of risk, scarcity, and controlled display did not vanish simply because a lute was tuned and a perfect sonnet composed. Instead, they were woven into the very fabric of courtship itself. The lyrical descriptions we admire so much are often breathtakingly oblique. They hint at moments of heightened proximity, accidental touch, shared secrets murmured too close for comfort, and a deep, breathless anticipation that stretches far beyond mere poetic metaphor. The elevated language serves not to elevate the emotion above the flesh, but sometimes, paradoxically, to disguise its earthy, biological urgency. Consider the architecture of desire in these verses. It is rarely described simply as longing. It is detailed, the precise way a lady's veil catches the light, the deceptive curve of her neck when she turns away, the sudden, shared glance across a crowded feasting hall. These aren't pastoral snapshots. They are carefully observed assessments of human vulnerability in a highly public space. The courtly man, therefore, was not merely a poet. He was an emotional strategist. His love, the asterisk finamers asterisk, was less a pure spiritual epiphany and more a complex social undertaking that required him to manage the perception of his own desire while simultaneously extracting value from another person's reputation. The poem itself became the primary vehicle for this exchange. A troubadour, skilled in both verse and psychology, could articulate a level of emotional intimacy through metaphor that circumvented direct confrontation or even outright scandal. By cloaking raw sexual tension within the safe, highly regulated structure of elevated poetry, men achieved something profound. They were able to process and perform their most primal urges under the guise of intellectual refinement. This allowed for a sustained sublimation of desire. The passion remained potent and real, but it was channeled away from direct physical risk and into the enduring medium of art. And while the poetry undeniably created an aesthetic ideal, the beautiful suffering lover, it simultaneously created powerful narratives of emotional expectation that carried immense economic weight. A woman's reputation in this context became her most valuable form of capital. If she was too easily available, if her compliance could be predicted, her value as both a political pawn and a muse plummeted. Thus, the idealized mystery surrounding the lady, the one whose virtue must be ritually maintained before her brilliance can properly unfold, was not merely a poetic embellishment. It was an essential economic condition for the courtly man's artistic livelihood. This dynamic created a profound hypocrisy that permeates even the most celebrated lyrical romances. The narrative celebrates devotion, yet the undercurrent of control is always present. Devotion demands compliance, and compliance must be purchased with social favor or material goods. It forces men to treat emotional fulfillment not as a freely given gift of the spirit, but as a slowly negotiated reward for maintaining complex personal reputations. The scandalous reality was that the most intimate exchanges, those moments alluded to in the poetry, where words become loaded with double meaning and physical suggestion, hangs heavy in the air, were often far more manipulative than any overt act. The gentle suffering depicted became its own form of exquisite power play, a consensual agreement between participants that allowed them to navigate deep personal wants, while adhering meticulously to the rigid public code. The Troubadour's Lullaby is therefore not just about sweet sorrow. It is a narrative masterpiece on emotional control. It teaches us that even in the supposed pinnacle of gentle emotion and artistic expression, the motives remain rooted in the oldest human currencies: status, survival, and the potent, undeniable force of the physical self. What appeared to be lofty philosophical love was, underneath the rich tapestry of verse, a highly elaborate system for managing desire's financial risk. It required vigilance, discretion, deep knowledge of social debt, and the unwavering maintenance of reputation. A scandal that could ruin one's livelihood far more surely than any physical lapse in judgment. The veneer of piety, it seems, was perhaps the oldest and most meticulously maintained performance of all. After traversing the financial calculations of inheritance, the sterile authority of the physician's cabinet, and the glittering artifice of courtly romance, we find ourselves finally standing before a different kind of tribunal, the church. Here, sin is not merely an unfortunate failing of blood or gold. It is fundamentally a matter of soul, visible through the lens of confession. The whispers that once carried market gossip and whispered debts now carry something infinitely more dangerous: the weight of eternal judgment. The physical mechanics of this process were ritualistic, designed to strip away everything but one's deepest secrets. To speak privately with a priest was an act of extreme vulnerability, a near surrender of self. It transformed the supposed intimacy into something inherently asymmetrical. The confessant speaks freely and exhaustively. The priest listens, interprets, and judges. This space, the confessional booth, became the ultimate theatrical stage where private vice met sacred law. It was here that the concept of public shame took its most potent, deeply spiritual form. The scandal whispered in the darkness did not just jeopardize one's reputation among peers, it threatened one's standing before God itself. And because reputation and piety were so inextricably linked within the medieval social order, a lapse in private morality carried immediate economic consequences, not of coin or land, but of grace. A man whose indiscretions were revealed could lose his standing with his lord, or worse, forfeit the favor needed to maintain political alliances. The power dynamic was terrifyingly subtle. The confessing individual approached this ritual already burdened, not just by sin, but by the very necessity of acknowledging that burden. They were seeking absolution, hoping for a reprieve from an unseen judge. Yet, in seeking spiritual clemency, they willingly offered their most personal details to an authority figure who wielded the power of judgment and disclosure. This was not merely psychological counseling. It was a formalized data extraction process, building a comprehensive dossier on human weakness. The priest, by nature of his office, became both counselor and inquisitor. His listening ear became a recording device for the worst moments of life: the affair in the shadowed courtyard, the petty theft born of need, the transgression against kin or oath. These confessions formed an invisible ledger of humanity's failings, solidifying the church's authority not through armies or laws, but through knowledge, the terrifying knowledge of individual depravity. The whispers themselves were a form of social control. They functioned like rumor in a modern city, only imbued with eternal consequence. A whispered indiscretion could ruin a lineage before a single letter was written. These secrets did not remain confined to the walls of confession. They sometimes spilled out, passed from one frightened confidante to another, eroding reputations, until a life was reduced to little more than gossip and stain. Consider the weight placed upon those who sought true spiritual cleansing. The process demanded a painful accounting, forcing individuals to meticulously reconstruct their history in terms of moral failure. If your sins were kept silent, they might be forgiven by providence. But if they were spilled out into the echoing dark of the confessional, they became codified, documented parts of your identity. This transformation was deeply unsettling, suggesting that the deepest intimacy, the sharing of utter shame, was itself a form of public exposure. This power, the power to know and the power to reveal, gave the religious authorities an immense leverage over secular life. A baron struggling for influence might find his personal indiscretions suddenly becoming matters of neighborhood discussion, whispers carried by passing servants or dubious associates. A merchant seeking a favorable trade deal could suddenly be derailed by knowledge gleaned from some forgotten, semi-sacred moment of weakness. Sin thus became the ultimate social weapon. The confessional model was profoundly successful because it provided the perfect blend of sanctuary and exposure. You were physically safe within those walls, yet emotionally raw, knowing that the words uttered had spiritual resonance, extending far beyond the immediate encounter. The sins confessed might be addressed by divine mercy alone, but their sheer weight upon one's soul created a moral debt that was keenly felt, shaping subsequent choices and fears. And so, in the final act of the medieval drama, we see how all human urges, the deep-seated needs for pleasure, status, security, and connection, were ultimately managed, measured, and contained by the mechanisms of guilt. The body's excess was treated with poultices or purging. The wealth's imbalance was corrected through marriage contracts. Desire's artifice was filtered through poetry. But the soul's transgression, that was addressed by a whisper, carefully gathered, and then wielded like both holy water and poison. It ensured that while we were free to live our lives in messy, complicated lust, we could never truly escape the watchful, listening ear of authority, whether that ear belonged to a lord, a physician, or a priest. We have journeyed through the rigid architectures of medieval life, the controlled chambers of the manor, the transactional negotiations within courts, and the damning tribunals of confession. We learned that every desire, whether for wealth, status, or mere pleasure, was catalogued, quantified, and ultimately subject to immense power structures. But life, as always, found a way to slip through the cracks of law and piety when the official channels failed to explain profound personal misery, a barren womb, unexplained sickness, sudden bursts of inexplicable lust. Humanity retreated into the comforting, yet profoundly dangerous, embrace of superstition. Here, sin ceased being merely a moral lapse requiring spiritual penance. It became a physical malady demanding magical intervention. The authority shifted from the bishop to the herbalist, and from the chancellor to the charlatan. This is the domain of folk belief, where fear mixed with biology, creating remedies as bizarre and unsettling as they were potent. The whispers of witchcraft tell us that the line between natural magic and simple ignorance was virtually non-existent. If a woman could not conceive, it was not merely an economic inconvenience. It was proof of malevolent interference, a curse laid by jealous rivals, or even unseen elemental forces. The inability to menstruate, or the onset of unpredictable reproductive cycles, were immediately pathologized as acts of dark power, requiring counterspells and rituals of painful realignment. And where there is great anxiety over reproduction, remedies are always involved. These supposed cures for sexual inadequacy or infertility ranged wildly in their application. Sometimes they involved poultices of toad skin mixed with goat excrement. Other times they suggested the consumption of specific body parts from animals believed to house vital sexual energies. The goal was never simply cure. It was often control, to regulate desire through fear and necessity. The notion of bad humors that plagued physicians gave way to a theory far more potent, that the human body was an open circuit, susceptible to external magical corruption. To remedy, this meant interacting with forces invisible to Christian doctrine, rituals involving specific geographic locations, a crossroads at midnight, under the light of a gibbous moon, were performed not for scientific understanding, but for supernatural alignment. The deepest and most unnerving remedies targeted the source of vice itself. If desire was excessive or misdirected, it suggested a foreign attachment, often interpreted as demonic influence or possession by minor malevolent spirits tethered to sexual craving. The supposed cure involved painful exorcisms administered with herbs, chants, and sometimes physical deprivation, aiming not for purification, but for temporary submission to the prevailing order. The practitioners of this dark knowledge held an intimate understanding of female anatomy and psychology, often gaining their power from women who themselves possessed unregulated sexuality. They understood that a woman's body was a source of potent magical energy, easily harnessed, misdirected, or bottled up for profitable remedy. A woman's menstrual blood was not just waste. It was described as a powerful conduit of lunar magic, highly valued both in healing salves and potions designed to induce artificial fertility, a commodity marketed directly from the uterus. The documentation surrounding these practices is disturbingly consistent. Sin and biology were inseparable. An unnatural sexual act didn't just generate social shame. It generated magical residue that could sour milk, ruin crops, or attract vengeful spirits. The consequence was a perpetual state of vulnerability, necessitating constant appeasement through costly ritual. The witches themselves became experts in regulating desire. They controlled knowledge, the specific recipe for love potions, the herbs to induce premature labor, the poultice to silence unwelcome whispers. This power allowed them to bypass the law and the church entirely, operating instead within a highly lucrative black market of bodily remediation. Imagine the desperation. A couple facing financial ruin due to the impossibility of producing an heir might turn to these remedies. The promise was not gentle, it was dramatic, almost violent in its necessity. They exchanged their remaining coin, the equivalent of years' labor, for a vial containing ground rabbit teeth mixed with mandrake root and whispered incantations. This transaction confirmed that nothing, not honor, not piety, nor the biological sanctity of bloodline, was immune to the brutal calculus of survival. The witch hunts crystallized this tension. When the community's anxieties about social stability, Chapter 5, merged with their fears over lineage, Chapter 6, the magic practitioners became scapegoats. They were accused not just of moral transgressions, but of failing the fundamental natural law, the order of birth and continuation that underpinned all feudal power. The remedy for a perceived magical sin was often death itself, administered by either ecclesiastical authority or fearful neighbor. This dark synthesis shows us that throughout medieval society, when institutional systems became too restrictive or intellectually incapable of addressing existential human anxieties, the vacuum was filled by the sublime, profitable terror of magic. The body became the ultimate battleground, a site for political dispute, economic transaction, spiritual failure, and finally, magical remedy. It was a deeply messy epoch where scientific rigor gave way to ritualized fear and personal desire transcended mere vice to become a matter of divine or diabolical threat. The human condition, it seems, has always found the most scandalous, profitable, and magically potent angle through which to express itself. We have journeyed through the intricate and often unsavory underbelly of medieval life. We saw how desire was weaponized by physicians, quantified by financiers, controlled by monastic walls, regulated in the market squares, tied to the precarious stability of the bloodline, formalized into poetic performance, interrogated within the confessional booth, and even condemned by the pyre as magical perversion. The thread connecting all these disparate threads, the soiled sheets of a wealthy manor, the stale air of an abbey's cloister, the frantic whispers in a tribunal hall, is nothing less than necessity. It is the desperate need to maintain order within chaos, the struggle to ensure that sin, whether personal or institutional, did not unravel the entire fabric of civilization. The medieval experience was fundamentally one of performance. Every life, every transaction, and indeed every whisper was a public presentation designed to uphold a fragile reality. This curtain never truly dropped, even in the deepest privacy. Reputation was always at stake. Scandal, therefore, was not just a private failing, it was an economic threat. It could destabilize an inheritance, collapse a merchant's credit, or dissolve a family name. And so, survival became the ultimate moral imperative. To live within the castles and towns of yesteryear was to constantly navigate this intricate gauntlet of expectation, scrutiny, and suspicion. The raw, messy, unstoppable currents of human desire were not merely tolerated, they were channeled, disciplined, monetized, and meticulously disguised. Consider the sheer stamina required for such a life. It required an unending performance of piety, coupled with pragmatic cruelty. One had to appear sufficiently devout before God, while remaining ruthlessly ambitious in the marketplace. One had to embody virginal purity when negotiating land titles. One had to maintain perfect silence within the Abbey walls, even as bodily needs mounted. The consequence was a deep, weary understanding of human nature, that what is labeled sin often amounts to nothing more than inconvenient desire, and what is deemed vice may simply be an expression of raw vitality in a suffocatingly rigid world. The scandals we observed, the dubious bloodletting cure, the compromised marriage, the illicit rendezvous under the watch of city guards, were not aberrations. They were evidence that life, despite all its moralizing doctrines and legalistic strictures, remained fundamentally organic, messy, unpredictable, and profoundly sexual. The system was designed for control, to manage potential energy. It sought to transmute chaotic desire into manageable assets. If a merchant could prove his honesty through impeccable breeding, or if a noblewoman secured her house's future through an advantageous, if ethically dubious, marriage, then the wildness of biology and emotion could be successfully contained within the rigid structures of law and finance. The resulting culture was thus one built upon magnificent contradictions. It championed sublime love poetry while simultaneously treating emotional vulnerability as a form of financial default. It preached divine austerity while utilizing bodies for everything from medicinal fluid analysis to political bargaining chips. The veneer of piety was merely the most durable commodity in a turbulent age, but it cracked under relentless scrutiny. The dawn, finally, reveals not a picture of perfect moral rectitude, nor is it one of utter, unbridled hedonism. Instead, what emerges from the ashes of scandal and compromise is something far more complex, a deep testament to human resilience. It is a portrait painted in shades of sweat, stained silks, vital blood, and desperate negotiation. We learn that history, particularly the history of the heart and the body, rarely adheres to the neat, linear progression dictated by canon law or dynastic decree. Instead, it spirals outward from the core impulse, the inescapable biological push toward connection, pleasure, and survival. The echoes of these centuries-old struggles did not merely pass away. they hardened into tradition, forming the invisible architecture of human civilization. They shaped legal frameworks that still govern property disputes, artistic ideals still defining notions of beauty, and moral pangs that continue to define our self-perception. The shadow cast by medieval sin was long, enduring, and remarkably influential. In surviving yesterday's scandals, humanity did not simply return to innocence. It acquired a profound cynicism, a weary intelligence recognizing that the most durable power structures are built not on righteous law, but on expertly managed whispers, meticulously hidden secrets, and the eternal exchange value of human vulnerability. The messy reality endured, shaping a civilization